So hello, this is Theo Blackmore from Disability Cornwall and the Isles of Scilly, and today I'm talking to
Lynne Turnbull, who I'm the Chief Exec at Disability Positive based in Cheshire.
Brilliant. So Disability Positive. So you're very far away from us. I've got some friends from Cheshire actually. Cheshire's a very rural county, is it?
It is, yeah. I mean, it's like everywhere. There's parts of rurality and there's parts that are a bit more urban, but it's pretty rural and quite big, yeah.
Famous for cheese.
Yes, love Cheshire cheese.
Great. So yeah, so you probably deal with a lot of the same issues that we'll do with that down here in Cornwall. So lots of the issues, for your organisation, from disabled people living in rural areas like rural isolation, poor infrastructure, local transport issues, all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
So how is it as a CEO of Disability Positive? What kinds of things do you deal with, all of that stuff?
So it's been interesting, really, Theo. I just finished a postgraduate certificate in strategic leadership, and I wrote my leadership assignment on leadership as a disabled leader through a pandemic, which was certainly very interesting and had its own challenges as a leader of a disabled people's organisation with a majority workforce who've got lived experience of disabling barriers in society, but also my own sort of lived experience, really. And it probably, I think I titled the assignment "A Bird in a Hurricane," which was probably quite apt in terms of how it felt at the time.
Right.
But we acted pretty quickly in terms of sending people home to work from home, and luckily we had the infrastructure and the systems to be able to do that. But I love being a leader here, actually, and I love actually the notion of that kind of lived experience leadership. I think that's actually really important and was invaluable through the pandemic, actually.
So what does lived experience bring then to the conversation, as it were?
I think because you have got a better understanding of the impact, so particularly from COVID, rather than just kind of being a leader but not really understanding what the additional risks might be or the additional impact might be. Having that lived experience yourself, you can bring that into the leadership role to really sort of show that empathy and share what the challenges are with the staff, and be really open and have those conversations about those challenges, and actually how are you planning on overcoming them, to make sure that people feel involved in the discussion and understand why what's happening is happening. So I think it brings a really unique part to that leadership aspect.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I remember I was interviewing some disabled people for a project, and the difference between being a disabled person and not a not disabled person. So I was interviewing disabled people, and at some points in the conversation, various different people would say to me just off the cuff, I've been doing this today, you know what it is, you know what it's like. And you can genuinely answer, yes, I do know what it's like, actually. They'll say, I catch the train every now and again, but you know what it's like. And it's like, yeah, I do, actually.
Yeah, definitely.
And I have conversations with friends, I remember I went on holiday with my wife years ago. We went somewhere and the hotel was fully accessible, we were told, by a non-disabled travel agent. We arrived there at 3:00 in the morning. We got there and we said, great, where's our room? He said, oh, it's on the second floor. The lift's over there. We went over. My wheelchair wouldn't fit in the lift.
Amazing.
Just little disasters like that. You can really empathise with people when you're talking to disabled people because of those sort of issues.
Yeah.
So the pandemic you mentioned there, the pandemic was incredible, wasn't it? As an organisation, I think that what happened to Disability Cornwall, I've said this before in other podcasts, was that we became very proactive instead of very reactive. So we were reaching out to disabled people in rural areas who are isolated, making sure that they got their food, making sure they got medicine, making sure they had social contact and PPE and all of that kind of stuff. I guess you probably did the same kind of things.
Very similar, actually, Theo. And it was, the PPE was an extraordinary point, I think, really, particularly around people who direct their own care.
Yeah.
and so it wasn't quite as easy. You couldn't phone up the central line to order PPE as a disabled person employing your own staff. You couldn't get it because you weren't working for a care agency. So we worked with the local authorities to get mass deliveries here, and then we just used volunteers to get those out to people so that they could receive them and keep themselves safe while they were still having their PA going in and supporting them at home. So yeah, we also were reactive, and that same bit around the social interaction, so regular contact with people. So it might have been the only contact that they had for the week, but just touching base, and it would flag up if there were any concerns that you could then kind of raise and then deal with separately. So if you didn't hear from somebody consistently, it would ring some alarm bells, and you could obviously just flag that to make sure that people were safe and well.
Yeah, I mean, we kind of did a bit of work. We took over a rugby pitch and just use it as an outdoor safe space so that we could then go there on good weather days and do just a bit of walking and talking with people, so people had social contact. And we also used the kitchen there, so we cooked up meals for people and things like that.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
As it progressed, you know, we were then delivering meals to people's houses when they couldn't come to that space. So, you know, all of that kind of stuff, I think that's some of the advantages of being in a rural area, because I can't imagine you do that in some inner city location in the same kind of way.
No, it's a very different response, and although there's been similarities, Theo, across different DPOs, there have been some nuances of points of difference, haven't there, on in terms of, you know, where they're located and what the needs were, I suppose, in the local area at the time, and how maybe the wider sector responded in terms of the wider community sector. So I think there was a big response, and I think that was really appreciated both by disabled people, but also you know, the public sector, who were also you know, we're in a pandemic, and what are we going to do? And I think we gave some really good answers and solutions during what was a very difficult time.
You know, that's really interesting, the whole thing about the public sector. So I don't know what your relationship as an organisation is with the public sector, or with like your local authority, or with your local health authorities. But we had a relationship before the pandemic, but following the pandemic and during the pandemic, it greatly improved. It got much better because they realised that we're in contact with a whole set of people that they just didn't know about. And even people who are receiving personal assistance and direct payments, you know, they didn't actually necessarily know directly where those people were. So it was something that they reached out to us to help them to get contact with those people. Yeah,
we had a similar thing where we've always had a good relationship with the local authorities, and health, and the ICS as it is now. But it was much better during the pandemic, and things like the vaccine rollout for personal assistance, the local authorities couldn't do that on their own, and couldn't reach all the PAs because they didn't know who they were. So I think that was another area where we were sort of really key in making sure we could get the message out that PAs were able to get the vaccine. So yeah, I think that was another tremendous part, and it's quite good, having just done a witness statement for the COVID inquiry. Actually, that's a really good period of reflection, just to kind of reflect back on some of the things that happened during COVID and what the impact was on disabled people. And it's been really interesting just to reflect back on that process, really, and some of the things that we did to help.
So you used some initials there, which some people might not know. You said ICS. What is ICS?
Sorry, the Integrated Care System. Sorry, Theo, we should learn not to use acronyms. But that's kind of the replacement, the partnership sort of work around here. So we've got a Cheshire and Merseyside footprint for the Integrated Care Board. And that's obviously made up of the different places across Cheshire and Merseyside. So that's the replacement for the clinical commissioning groups.
Yeah, it's great, isn't it? All the jargon we have to go through. Yeah. So basically that's kind of health and social care, is it, coming together? Yeah. And are you involved in that process locally?
The voluntary sector, health watch are involved, obviously, which is separate to us. So the local health watch are integral to it as the wider voice for kind of citizens in health and care. The local infrastructure voluntary sector organisation attend the place partnership locally, but we kind of attend a sector leadership group in the local area, which is made up of a range of chief execs from different community sector organisations. So we're able to kind of feed in. So although we've only got one place on there, we're able to make sure that we can represent our different groups, if you like, well, that we support. But they've got some work streams attached to it. So I go to one of the work streams around governance, which isn't everyone's bag because it can be quite dry. But I don't mind governance. So just helping organise the governance around the place partnership.
Yeah, you're always top of the toes, aren't you, in relation to governance and all of that kind of keeping things going?
I think it's years and years of being a company secretary and having to kind of know the company law and the charity legislation that kind of underpins it. I'm not the company secretary anymore, but I did it for long enough where you just kind of, I think even as a chief exec, Theo, you're living and breathing governance all day, every day.
Yeah,
in some shape or form.
And so we went through the COVID pandemic there, which was what it was, and it was a complete nightmare. And, 66 or more % of the people who died from COVID were disabled people, and it's not finished. We've just had, I don't work from the office, I work from home, but the office currently, they've had a couple of COVID cases there. I mean, are you back in the office again as an organisation?
Yeah, it's a really good. During the pandemic, we had about 75 of our 77 staff working from home, and a couple that were kind of very, very office related. It was very difficult to have them working from home because of what their job entails. But since, I think it was November 2021, we changed people's contracts to work from home permanently as a permanent solution. That doesn't mean everyone does work from home. We're finding that although people's contracts say that they work from home, they'll come in for team meetings. They might come in and do one day a week just so that they've got a bit of interaction. I think, again, that's based on being very individual. So some staff might live alone. So actually being able to see work colleagues gives them a bit of interaction with people. Some love working from home and it works very well and don't come in very often. But we've got the building and we kind of reimagined the space to put more hot desking areas in, so the staff who kind of are working from home get to kind of come into this space and they've got this real vibrant buzz going on when they're all in and they're all kind of at a desk. So it's quite nice to see how it works, but most people are at home most of the time, Theo. So that's what you've done, is it, as well?
Well, no, our organisation, lots of people back in the office again because that's the way they prefer to work. There's all sorts of stuff tied up in it, isn't there? Like you say, there's people who live on their own, so it's kind of the social contact and it's that kind of thing that people get from work in a big way.
Yeah.
But there's also the stuff about how organisations work and how do you share that information, and that whole thing about being able to talk across the desk and say, hang on a minute, I've got this going on. What do you do in that situation?
Yeah. And I think that's what people miss, but we tailored the contracts for individuals. So people who said that they preferred to work from the office, their contracts continue to say that they work from the office. Those who preferred to work from home, it says that they work from home. So we were fairly flexible in terms of the response to that, really based on individuals.
Right.
But yeah, it's nice that people will get together for a meeting, so you get to see each other, because it's great seeing people virtually, and some of the solutions that we did in being able to keep working during the pandemic. Technology's been amazing, but sometimes you're quite right, there's nothing like having someone across from you that you can just say, oh, I've got this happening, what do you think about that, and just sounding people out.
Yeah, and it's amazing. So we are living in a completely different world. This is something that many disabled people have been campaigning for years, trying to get more homework in, because we have been able to do it for years, but with the pandemic, suddenly everyone had to do it. So therefore it was available to everybody. And so therefore disabled people could do it as well.
Yeah.
And, you know, in many ways, I was talking to some DPOs and they were saying things like, well, it's nothing new to us. We've been doing it for years anyway. We've got staff who work at home from bed and, you know, from all sorts of different situations. So why is no different for us as an organisation?
No.
You know, that was very interesting. So you also mentioned in passing that you've just finished a qualification. What is it that you've just done?
It's a postgraduate certificate in strategic leadership. So yeah, it was fascinating. Really enjoyed it actually. Going back to academia and doing literature reviews. It's been a while, but yeah, really enjoyed it.
So was that through a local university or a college or something?
Yeah, so through the University of Chester, and the assignments were based on, so one on leadership, one on governance and finance, and one on marketing. So they were interesting, but they all had a thread of COVID going through it, either during COVID or life after COVID. More to do with the timing of it, really, and it was kind of fresh. But again, just a really good period of reflection on both what the literature tells us and what we can take from that, and actually how that applied in the workplace and how relevant that was to us and what learning there is to take from it. So it's been quite interesting, and the kind of recommendations that I made to myself, I suppose, within the assignments, we've kind of implemented within the organisation. So that's been quite interesting as well.
Great. So academia feeding into real life, big time.
Yeah, it was really interesting to see, I think, Theo. And I think one of the main ones was when you look at going back to the leadership bit, but actually it was a common theme through all of them. When you look at any research around diversity and leadership, for example, particularly during the pandemic, you found lots of data and intelligence around diversity in terms of ethnicity and gender and sexual orientation, but nothing at all about disability, which I found very interesting in its absence, almost like it had been forgotten as a protected characteristic.
Yeah.
And I suppose that was a really interesting piece, I suppose, for the assignments, that the absence of it, yeah, did appear to as though it had not been considered as an area of sort of diversity to think about from a leadership point of view.
You know, it's interesting, isn't it? So disabled people, we are without doubt the largest minority group. You know, it's almost, there's almost so many of us that we're not a minority anymore. But we are excluded from all sorts of things in that kind of way. You know, when you're going through academic literature, it's quite hard to find things sometimes when you're looking at a particular subject, which includes disability, because it includes all the other protected characteristics, like you say.
Yeah.
Which is a strange thing. And it's part of the role, I think, of DPOs to stop that from happening. But, you know, I had this conversation just a couple of days ago with Tracy Lazard from Inclusion London. And we were talking then about how, you know, from the 1970s up to the present day, you know, there's all sorts of different minority groups that have increased in kind of status in many ways and increased their kind of local public awareness of it. But disability doesn't seem to have done that in the same kind of way. And it's still a job that we've got to do.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge, I think, Theo, that we face here, but I think collectively across DPOs. And I do think about that quite a lot, really. You know, is it just good marketing? Has there just been someone behind really, really excellent marketing campaigns that have raised the profile? But I try and work out why we haven't achieved the same thing, despite all the sort of activism and despite all the fighting for all the time in terms of the right for independent living, etc., for disabled people. But in terms of that profile, particularly in the media, it is really interesting. Is it because it's so big people don't understand the breadth of the barriers that exist within society? Or is it because people still don't necessarily understand the social model, so are still looking at things very much from the kind of we can fix you kind of scenario from a medical model? But it is quite interesting how it doesn't seem to have the voice, despite the fact, as you say, we're quite rightly with the largest minority group.
Yeah, it's like 1 in 7 of the population or more. And the whole thing about the social model, if you walk out in the street and you said to somebody, can you tell me about the social model of disability? The answer will undoubtedly be no.
Yeah.
And so it's just something that's not, it hasn't, I don't know how you get the traction on it and how you get it to hold even, younger disabled people, it's not taught in schools and colleges anywhere,
No.
really. And so I think with younger disabled people as well, there's a big challenge there about how do you educate younger disabled people about the social model? Is it still relevant to them? Do they want a new model? Do you know what I mean? It's all kind of, I personally think we need to keep it and we need to grow it and use it much more, but it's something that I don't know if younger people even know about.
We did some work collectively, because most of a lot of our work is kind of done in partnership or collectively with other DPOs, Theo. But there's a group of us who are local disabled people's organisations here in Cheshire, that we formed Cheshire Disabled People's Panel, and we did that sort of as a result of the pandemic, in part because we're all experiencing the same issues. The barriers are very similar, particularly in the same geographical area. And rather than writing 5 letters or 6 letters from all the different individual members, that idea of being able to write a letter collectively from all of us felt like a stronger voice, a bit like what we've done, Theo, with Our Voices and with the Disabled People's Organisations Forum England. We've had some great success in terms of collaborating and joining together to raise some of the issues and challenges that disabled people are facing. And I think in Cheshire that was helpful, because they did form a Future of Social Care Commission, and we were able to talk to them about that and to really remind them of the importance of co-production and making sure that disabled people are involved as equal partners in the design of policies and services that are going to affect them. And really hammering that point home, that it's not a consultation, because that's just saying we've sat in a dark room and come up with something, what do you think about it? And that's not what we mean at all. But as a result of it covered lots and lots of different aspects, Theo, as part of that commission, from paying for care. So obviously lots of people came to talk about what the impact of paying for care was, and how that impacted on their day-to-day life with lived experience. But it also covered what a vision for kind of adult social care would be. And it all starts with that kind of nothing about us without us that we know very well in this sector, which is very real. And as a result of the commission, the local authority and Cabinet accepted the recommendations of trying to embed the social model of disability locally, but also kind of underpinning everything with the principles of the UNCRPD, which is great, but there's a huge job there to make sure that happens, Theo. So it's still ongoing.
Great. Now, just to de-jargon one little bit of that, the UNCRPD is?
Sorry, it's the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Disabled People.
Yeah, and that's interesting, that idea about you working with other DPOs, because we started doing that as well during the pandemic, or we set up something called the Disability Alliance, and again, it brought together local DPOs to just have a greater voice. And so suddenly, instead of covering, 100, working with 100,000 disabled people locally, you just massively increase the number of people that you're reaching and the breadth of knowledge within the organization, really.
Yeah.
And the local authority then interacts with you much more, because they think, hang on a minute, you're covering all these different groups of people, which is much more an effective way of working, I think.
And I think where we've done that on a national basis as well, through kind of the peer support aspect, which was really helpful of Our Voices during the pandemic, because it's pretty lonely as the chief exec, but being able to speak to other chief execs that I'm sure we're going great at the same time with running an organisation during a pandemic. But then the Disabled People's Organisations Forum England, I think it's been really helpful to, well, it's sad, isn't it, that you see the issues replicated up and down the country, but what it shows is consistently the challenges that we're all facing are very, very similar, regardless of where we are from a geographical point of view. And yeah, there'll always be some slight nuances, as we spoke about earlier, but I think there is that commonality, and I think we're much stronger when we voice those together rather than all trying to do that individually.
Yeah, the commonality is, I mean, it's massive commonality. The kind of the social model of disability and the whole sort of oppressive forces against disabled people are the same wherever you are and almost whoever you are.
Yeah.
And so that's just across the board, whether you're in an urban or a rural environment, and whether you're a person with learning difficulties or a person who's a wheelchair user, or whether you're, it just goes across all the different groups, whether you're male or female. And there are particular groups, sort of the intersectionality thing is a big deal, I think, which is underrepresented within the disabled people's organisations movement. And I think we need more intersectional organisations working particularly representing themselves and working with themselves. I don't know how you feel about that. I mean, do you have any groups up in Chester?
Completely agree around the intersectionality, and I think it's become more and more apparent, hasn't it? And I think that is very welcome, but it's about how we make sure that as collective groups of DPOs we're reaching those and welcoming those DPOs who might work with specific individuals, that we've got that intersectionality, because they're female and disabled or whatever the case may be. And I think that's really important, because the barriers again are just slightly different, but there's always a commonality across all of them.
Yeah, and it gets more threatening in many ways as well. So during the COVID, if you're from a particular minority ethnic group, then you have more chance of getting COVID, and if you're a disabled person, you have more chance again, and then blah blah, and so it goes on.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. Yeah.
You said the title of your thesis. What was it again?
A bird in a hurricane.
Bird in a hurricane. A friend of mine was talking about. I did a conference last year, and a friend of mine, we named it. I named it because he mentioned a phrase. He said valuing the canaries, because his idea was about the canary in the coal mine. Canaries are taken down into coal mines, and they're there on the basis that if the oxygen runs out, or if there's some toxic gas there, then the canaries are first to perish, and so then everyone else gets out. And he said, well, disabled people are the canaries. We are the ones in the hurricane. We are the birds in the hurricane trying to face the hurricane. And when everyone else notices and it starts affecting them, then they begin to take notice a bit more. We are the canaries. You said something just then about being lonely at the top as a chief executive, and that's something that's always struck me. It's not so easy for you to turn around as a chief executive and say to somebody else, hey, what do you do in this situation? Because you are the only one within your organisation who's got your job.
Yeah.
How is that? You said it's quite lonely sometimes, but is it challenging? It must be very challenging.
It's challenging, but I love a challenge, Theo. But it's I've got a good board who I could pick up the phone and I could talk to the board and say, this is what I'm thinking, because I've got delegated authority for most things, Theo. But I can kind of pick up the phone and say, hey, this is where my train of thought is. What do you think about that? But I think the most helpful is just having really strong relationships with the disabled people's organisations there, because you can't beat it. You can't beat talking to other people from other disabled people's organisations that genuinely understand what it is that you're experiencing from the same job role. So actually, even just picking up the phone and talking to a neighbouring chief exec from a DPO in the next sort of county over can be tremendously helpful. But I think that sharing information and knowledge is helpful. There were some things that we'd done, for example, around a COVID risk assessment and a COVID policy, that actually other chief execs said, oh, that'd be really helpful. If you've already done it, will you share it with me, so we don't have to start from zero. And very willing to kind of share that. And equally, if someone else had done something else first, it can just be helpful to help you hit the ground running, really, so to speak.
It feels to me a bit like we as organisations are getting better at that. I remember back in the days, I'd set a couple of organisations up, and there was a real kind of sense in those days that you were all on your own. Organisations were working on their own, and it was very difficult to share information. There are obvious times when we're in competition with each other, for example, over, because there's very little funding out there. And so if you come across a pot of funding that's available, you might not share that news so widely. But I think that's changing a bit. I think we do share that information more widely now.
I think that is changing, Theo, because I think it has to. One of our when we decided to rebrand in 2020, we did postpone it, Theo, because of the pandemic. It was supposed to be in April 2020, but we didn't go ahead with it until the August. But for me, that one of our clear values is about collaboration, and we can't do everything ourselves. We have to work together. It's the only way that I think DPOs can have the voice to be able to try and influence change, because we're not there yet, Theo, and there's still a way to go. We're not living in a society where disabled people don't have any barriers. That's not where we are. So there's still plenty of work for us DPOs to do. But I think we have to work together, and I think that helping with capacity building is crucial. So making sure that where it's a relevant contract that should be delivered by disabled people's organisations, for example, like advocacy or direct payment support, that we work with other local DPOs to make sure that they can deliver that in their local area. And if they've not got the experience of doing it, then we can help you. Or if it's something that we've not got experience with, hopefully we'll be able to find a partner that would be able to work with us, and vice versa. But I think that's really important that we continue to work together, because I think we've got proven examples through the pandemic, through those different routes that we've got on those national kind of forums where we're all coming together and we're all fighting for the same common goal, to try and make things better.
And it is amazing because there are commonalities, but there are amazing differences. So, I do know some local authorities that contract their local DPO to provide direct payment services, and I know others that don't.
Yeah, it's quite mixed here, Theo. So at the moment we're commissioned to deliver one, and we work in part because it goes across a footprint, so we work with another DPO as well, but we lost one on the other half of the county, and that went to a non-disabled people's organisation, which is really sad. And obviously we hear that up and down the country where that's happened. But I think that's incredibly sad, because there's something unique about what disabled people's organisations can do from that peer support aspect of supporting disabled people. But I think we've got to get better at how we explain what our USP is, our unique selling point, when we're looking at those bids, because you're up against shiny websites, and they look very polished and very corporate and all very nice, and that might look very attractive, but in reality you can't beat the outcomes that we can help people to achieve, Theo, because of that lived experience aspect, of the fact that your workforce, your board, your management, your staff, your volunteers have all got that kind of lived experience and understand the process, and have probably gone through that process themselves in terms of looking at directing their own care or whatever it might be. So I think we've got to get better at being more vocal about the value that we bring as disabled people's organisations, because we've lost something, I think, Theo, since the Improving Life Chances report, for example, or the Putting People First Concordat, where it mentions having a DPO in every local authority area. We don't have anything like that to fall back on anymore, so it's become harder to stand out, really.
Yeah, it is amazing, isn't it, though, that these services are given to non-DPOs to deliver.
Yeah,
I just wonder what the thinking is within like the local authority, when they think, actually, if it was a service for women, they wouldn't give it to an organisation run by men for men, would they?
No,
it doesn't work like that. But it does in relation to disability.
Yeah.
That we're still being taken care of.
Yeah,
it's very nice of them. It's very nice of them to look after us in that way, but
it isn't what we want, and it's But it'll be interesting, you know, where those cases have happened, where it's been awarded to a non-disabled people's organisation. It's interesting to see the longevity of that. So does that only last for like one term? Does it get extended? And actually, do people complain about it? You know, because if everyone thinks all is well and it's great, then you know they'll be none the wiser, really. So I think that's quite a difficult one, but it's definitely a challenging environment out there. But I think the only way to get through this, Theo, is that we work together and we continue to work together.
We need a thing, don't we? Like you say, our USP. We need I think what we need is a way of measuring the outcomes that we provide that non-DPOs don't provide. We need some kind of USP that says, actually, this is a thing, bang, that they can't do, that we can do.
Yeah.
You know, for me, it's all about social capital, cultural capital. You know, my PhD was all about those different kinds of capital, but it's all about those kinds of things. It's about how disabled people get on with each other, the skills and knowledge and understanding that we have and that we just bring to the table as soon as we pick up the phone, whatever the person says.
It's been a really interesting journey, that, Theo, just looking at kind of social value, really, and what you bring as an organisation. And you know, I find like some of them were great on in terms of the social and the kind of innovation type stuff, and to some degree the economic bits around, you know, kind of employing disabled people is a great element of that kind of social value. But some of the stuff around environmental can be quite challenging when you look at something like the social value portal. It can be quite challenging for a disabled people's organisation to kind of measure you know, your tonnage or whatever in terms of savings, and there's some general things that we've done, you know, with LED light bulbs and so on, but some of that, it doesn't seem quite as sexy as kind of what they're looking at in terms of the environmental impacts. So I think thinking more and more about the environmental impacts and climate change, I think it's going to become more and more important to being able to demonstrate that social value, because they're not just looking at one or two things. They want you to show something social, something economic, something environmental, for example. So that's quite interesting to look at. But we do measure it as an organisation, and then record that in our annual report, which we started to do last year. And you know, that's fascinating in terms of, as an organisation, the level of value, social value that we generated in the last year. So and we try and target at least 10%. So we achieve way over that. So about 38% off the top of my head, Theo, I think it was, in terms of social value that we generated, putting a figure on it.
Yeah. You know, for me, there's this whole thing around, so there's stuff that we do as organizations. So I don't know how many, these are questions that we need to figure out, I think, as a sector, but I don't know. So, for example, there was a big government employment scheme, and it's all about sheltered employment, and it was called Remploy, and it closed down in 2012. I don't know how many disabled people they employed across the country as a project, but it might be I think it was something like 8,000 disabled people were employed. And I don't know how many disabled people we employ as a sector, but I think we're getting towards that figure. So I think that the numbers of people that we employ is bigger than any kind of government program that they've kind of ever brought in. And so we just do that. That's because it's what we do. And then there's all the other stuff around the health impact that we have. Because if you're employing disabled people, then those disabled people are getting all the social benefits out of being employed. They're getting all the different things that we all value in out of getting work and out of working. You know, all the different health impacts that will have on positive health impacts. And then also the reducing loneliness stuff. You know, they say that feeling lonely is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So we massively reduce loneliness for disabled people, both as people who we work with, but also the people who we employ and our volunteers.
Yeah.
So there's masses of stuff in there that we need to kind of unpack, I think, in terms of what we bring and what we save. At the end of the day, it's difficult to demonstrate what's not happening, isn't it? If people are working for us, then they're not spending time in health or social care institutions or whatever it might be. But that's something I think we need to kind of figure out and just really quantify it and knuckle down on that, I think.
Yeah, and that, as an exercise kind of across the board, across all DPOs, as a kind of follow-on from, the work that you'd already started, Theo, in terms of looking at that research and gathering that, I think it's tremendously helpful to bring that together, because it, again, shows the true value and the scale, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it demonstrates us as a sector, because I always think of us as a separate sector almost. I mean, we're part of the voluntary sector, clearly. We share some of the issues of the voluntary sector, but we do have our own set of issues that we have to deal with as well.
I agree with that. I think there's a place in it within the wider community sector, but I agree with you. I think DPOs are a sector in their own right. So that partnership working is critical across those DPOs, more so perhaps than kind of working in partnership with just wider community organisations. Because that way you can pick up those intersectional bits as well that we talked about. So specific or disabled people's organisations that work, with women or particular ethnicity groups. So that's really important.
Yeah, working together as a sector. So what about the future? What does the future look like for DPOs? How do you work with younger disabled people? How do you kind of grow the people who are to come into our organisations, as it were? Do you do mentoring programs?
Yeah, so we don't do it's not an area that we've done historically, Theo, in terms of formal kind of mentoring programs, if you like. We do work with younger disabled people, so we're able to collate views of disabled people from a wide breadth of ages, which is really helpful to understand where the differences are, again, in terms of people's experiences and where that differs. We do, we've got lots of different services, but we do a lot of work around kind of work placements or work experience. So that's obviously really helpful for younger disabled people. Really successful in terms of confidence building, because you're kind of with people who you can relate to and understand the challenges that you're facing, and obviously DPOs are amazing at putting reasonable adjustments in place that are excellent, that show that people can work with the right, providing they've got the right support from the employer. Ultimately, there's an opportunity for people to be able to work. What we also have is that with our younger age groups that we work with, they may go through a service and they're receiving support through that group, and then they may go into volunteering. So they start volunteering within that group to support other young people who are kind of younger than them, which is great. So we don't have formal mentoring programs, but we are kind of supporting people to kind of progress and look at those volunteering opportunities and look at those work experience opportunities, or even doing a work placement. That tends to be younger disabled people that tend to do those placements with us.
Yeah, I always think of disabled people's organisations as being a fantastic opportunity for disabled people to work in. It's pretty much, if you can come up with a good idea and we can get funding for it, then you can do it. And if that involves making a film, making podcasts, doing TikTok, whatever it might be.
Yeah.
So I think there is just like a real strength, I think, within our organisations for the potential to be nurturing the next generation and bringing them all on.
Definitely.
So the future, how's the future? Future's a rosy future?
I think it's a challenging future, because we can only base it on how things are today. But I think if we continue to work collectively, Theo, as organisations, and really, I think it is about how we help people understand the social model and what our USP is as disabled people's organisations, in terms of that disabled people as equal partners, that whole ingrained approach of co-production. It isn't new to us. It's been our fundamental bread and butter since we started, because that's what we're about. I think we can start to change the landscape, but everything, Theo, is going to be caveated, I suppose, by what administration you're dealing with at the time and what policies are around disabled people. I mean, that is, crystal ball stuff, but we're only capable of doing what we can do as DPOs to amplify the voice of disabled people, but we'll also be reliant on whatever government policy is at the time.
It's quite an amazing thing, isn't it? We are only able to do what we're able to do. But, one of the things that strikes me is a thing that I was thinking about a while ago is about, health and social care and all of that is kind of conceptualized the wrong way around, I think. So, there's lots of social care professionals who go out and do their work and this, that, and the other. And we're, of course, they need more time, they need more money, they need all the things that they're asking for, as do all the health bodies and all of that. But the reality is that social care wouldn't exist without us.
No.
It's they always put the boot on the wrong foot, I think. Disabled people, we provide employment for thousands and thousands of people across the country, and whole bits of the economy are really reliant on us. And I think that I don't know how we demonstrate that. I thought one day, all the strikes that are happening, if disabled people went on strike and refused social care for a day, which we can't do, it's life-threatening. It's not something I'd recommend. But if we could,
No.
If we could do that, it would just demonstrate absolutely how dependent everyone is on us.
Yeah.
And it's I'm just trying to figure out how that would happen, how we would do that, what would happen, how could that work? But it's, we generate a huge amount of money in the economy. We keep the economy going in many ways.
Yeah.
So thank you very much. Is there anything that you'd like to talk about that we haven't talked about?
I think so, Theo. I think we've covered everything. It's been nice chatting.
Yeah, no, it has as well. I think it's been quite a positive thing as well. I mean, we haven't spoken about the cost of living crisis. We haven't spoken about the fact that most people who go to food banks are disabled people, and we haven't spoken about the poorest section of the community are disabled people, and we're always the most downtrodden. But I think those are ground that we've covered before. I'm always surprised it's not more in the press, all of those kind of facts and figures and stats.
But I think that goes back to the point earlier, Theo. So, all those things are very real at the moment in terms of the impacts and the levels of poverty, particularly, and the impacts on disabled people, the cost of living crisis, energy, and again through a lot of collective work through, the Disabled People's Campaign Group, the Disability Poverty Campaign Group, which is a group of DPOs. I've had some great success around that, and I think that collective work is really important because individually there's a huge issue around core funding and that kind of policy work. That the money isn't there quite the same, Theo, around policy work as perhaps where it used to be kind of 15, 20 years ago. Which I think is really sad. So actually being able to join forces around that stuff just helps on kind of that capacity where we've all got a tiny bit of capacity but not enough to do huge pieces of work, but together we can be a lot stronger on it. But I think the whole challenge around some of those barriers goes back to that overarching premise of the fact that it doesn't feel as though disability is seen as a protected characteristic right now. And that'll be why we're not seeing more in the media around cost of living, in my opinion, because disability is kind of not being seen as a protected characteristic.
Yeah. We've just been through another comic relief, and we are always there in the comic relief, but it's because they're trying to buy stuff for us all the time.
Yeah.
We're at the wrong end of the chain again.
Yeah.
Listen, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for your time. And
talking to you, Theo, as always, and look forward to next time.
Brilliant. I'll let you know when it becomes available. Thank you very much for your time.
Take care. See you later. Bye.
Cheers, bye.